Welcome back to the Stronger by Science podcast. My name is Eric Trexler. I am the special temporary primary host. I think I got that right, correct?
Yeah.
Union's okay with that?
Sure.
Perfect. Today I am joined by Greg. He is currently the permanent guest co-host for now and a prominent leader in the, what's the name of your union again?
The Stronger by Science podcast co-host union.
Correct. Yeah. And I assume you do great work with that organization, who I'm on very good terms with. We've got a lot to cover in today's show. Before we get to that, if you enjoy the show and you would like to support it, there are many ways that you could do that. You could like, rate, or subscribe wherever you happen to get podcasts. You could join our email newsletter. You could do that at strongerbyScience.com/newsletter. You could use our discount code at Bulk Supplements. If you go to bulksupplements.com and you use the discount code SBSPOD, that'll get you a 5% discount off your entire order. You could subscribe to the Mass Research Review. That is a monthly research review that we are co-authors of. Or you could check out our diet app, which is called Macro Factor, and it does offer a free trial. So, Greg, how is the road to the stage?
Road to the stage is going well. This past week was a pretty solid week. Hit a new low, 227.2. And I'm a pound away from a milestone I'm very much looking forward to, the 2/3 way point along my journey of this current cut. And yeah, just kind of looking back at the week, a big bright spot was that this past week was the busy week in my month with mass writing, and it ended up being far busier than I anticipated. So if you subscribe to Mass, just here's a little peek ahead. A slight change in format is coming. So we're going to start having a cover story for each issue that will also be published concurrently on Stronger by Science. And so I'm doing the cover story for this upcoming month. And I won't tell you what it is yet. I teased it on Instagram a few days ago, but if you missed it, it was a story, and they are fleeting and ethereal by nature. So you'll find out June 1st otherwise. But anyway, the work required to get to the point that I could start writing ended up being a lot more than I anticipated. So a busy week turned into a week bordering on hellish in terms of total workload. And previously in situations like that, I would have a tendency to just kind of like stress eat to numb the stress and just bad vibes that I'm experiencing. And I did not do that this past week. And I've noticed over time as this cut has progressed that is a skill that I have gained and developed over time, where, you know, I've found other ways of coping with stress and making myself feel better rather than food. So, you know, I like not only did the last week go well, but it went well in spite of an obstacle that I think previously would have tripped me up. So yeah, I feel good about that overall.
Nice. Yeah, like you mentioned, it's been a crazy week, very busy in the cluster of entities associated with the Stronger by Science universe. And listeners might wonder, is that why Eric stumbled over half the words in the introduction? I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to leave that up to interpretation. But yes, I theoretically could have gotten more sleep the last few days. Would have been nice. But anyway, yeah, I think this is going to be a really nice issue of Mass. I think your cover story turned out great. And there's a lot of good studies this month.
Yes, sir.
Now, Road to Athens, would you even believe it? I don't have any updates. I've barely had an opportunity to step foot in a gym the last few days, but that's okay. No steps backward, which is good. I like that. What about Feats of Strength?
Feats of Strength. So yeah, last episode, I mentioned some big gym lifts from Jessica Bittner. Her competition was this past week, and as expected, she did very well. hit a new unofficial world record for both the squat and the deadlift in her weight class. That's the 76 kilo class, I believe. So she squatted 217.5 kilos, which is 480 pounds, and deadlifted 252.5 kilos, which is like 556 pounds. So yeah, great performance for her. Looked like she had more in the tank for everything. So, you know, if she is pushed at Worlds, which I suspect she might be, like Worlds is coming up, and I expect that her and what's her name from New Zealand, Tongotea, are probably going to be gearing up for quite the battle in that weight class. So yeah, we'll see what's to come, but great performance from her. And then let's circle back to Julius Maddox's world, where we haven't visited in a while. But yeah, he recently hit 361 kilos or 796 pounds in the gym for bench press, which I don't need to contextualize that. Those are just nutty numbers. We're still waiting for the first 800-pound bench in competition, and you know, once again, he looks like he's gearing up for it, and I hope he does it.
Awesome. Yeah, it's getting ever closer to that 800 number that everybody's looking forward to. Yep. So I'm excited to see that. All right, moving on to the content for today's episode. We've got a couple Coach's Corner segments. So I feel like you and I have just been like up to our ears in the research literature the last few days with what we're working on. So it'll be a nice little change of pace to shift focus a little bit and be a little bit more practical and applied for these Coach's Corner segments. Of course, they're all informed by research to some extent, but you know, not a nitty gritty research review. So for my Coach's Corner, I want to talk about a dietary strategy that I've used. It almost kind of has felt like a very natural default way of eating for me whenever I'm cutting or just trying to kind of passively reduce calorie intake. So for example, if I notice that my body weight is starting to creep up and I'm not tracking macros at the time, I might implement this strategy to stop that upward trajectory. Or if I'm about to enter a cutting phase, I might proactively implement this strategy. And there's not a great word for it. So instead, I'm just going to use like a kind of like a Mad Libs of just buzzwords here. I think you could kind of refer to it loosely as protein sparing modified time restricted feeding. It sounds like kind of a nonsense jumble of buzzwords, like I said, but what I am really getting at with this strategy is the fact that OMAD, 1 meal a day, as an eating pattern, is getting relatively popular. I mean, it's not like huge, but there are more people doing it now than I can ever recall in the past, and doing it explicitly as an intentional eating strategy.
Yeah, doing it intentionally. I mean, go back far enough, I'm sure there were plenty of people who were only eating 1 meal per day, but for different reasons.
Yeah, but it's I've never before seen as many people who say, I am intentionally restricting myself to 1 meal a day as a dietary strategy for fitness purposes.
Yeah.
And I really do get the draw, because if you've ever experimented with that approach, you'll generally find that you end up doing a lot of very passive calorie restriction simply by having such a restrictive feeding window. You know, like time restricted feeding, the most common application is like an 8-hour feeding window, which honestly is not that tight of a feeding window. I mean, that's basically like skip 1 meal at the beginning or end of the day, and you're in that window, like pretty much no problem. But you know, some people will say, well, instead of doing an 8-hour feeding window, I'll do 6 or maybe 4. And then 1 meal a day is as tight as a feeding window can really get, unless you're doing the high school buffet style 1 meal a day, where you show up to the buffet, spend your $8, and you just sit down for like 7 or 8 hours and eat until they kick you out.
Yeah.
But aside from that, one meal a day, you're usually talking about a feeding window that's, 60, 90 minutes, something like that.
Or I mean, if you eat fast enough, they might kick you out after like 2 hours.
Yeah,
and
that is true.
May or may not have firsthand experience with that.
Yeah.
Gin Buffet in Mocksville, North Carolina. You're on notice. You permanently banned me from the lunch buffet in 2009, and I still have not forgotten.
Yeah, the Twin Dragon.
Maybe they've forgotten.
They might have.
Ooh, next time I'm home, I might roll the dice.
The Twin Dragon was a lot more accommodating back in my younger years. I mean, you could really settle in there for quite some time before you got any attention. But anyway, one meal a day, generally speaking, you're talking about a very tight feeding window. And it does help with some passive calorie restriction. What I mean by passive is without being overly intentional about your food choices, you might find that simply by eating in a tighter window, it's hard to go too far beyond whatever your number is, 2,400, 2,800, 3,200 calories in that single meal. And another benefit specifically with the one meal a day approach is depending on your psychological makeup, it could help you keep your mind off of food throughout the day. Now, I've definitely seen this completely backfire and go the opposite direction, where because you are restricting to one meal a day, throughout the whole rest of the day, all you're thinking about is, damn, sucks I didn't have breakfast. Man, wish I had lunch. So you have to really individualize and think about your personal experience if you're going to implement this type of strategy. For me, as someone who's not that food focused in nature, if I tell myself, hey, I'm having one meal a day, the rest of the day, I just kind of get busy and forget about it and focus on other things. Have some coffee, have some water, maybe a diet soda here and there. It's really not something that I think about frequently and recurrently, throughout the day. Now, here's the problem with one meal a day is it's really not great for protein distribution. Generally speaking, the research would indicate that we would prefer to get 3 or more large servings of protein throughout the day. So 3 or more large boluses that are giving us at least, 20, 30, 40 grams of protein a day. And with one meal a day, obviously that's not going to be possible. It's not going to be a, feasible goal to try to make both of those things work. And that also with one meal a day can put you in a somewhat challenging position where you have to say, well, do I want to have, pre-exercise protein or post-exercise protein? You don't get the ability to have pre and post. And along those lines, you have to try to make some difficult decisions of like, do I want to go into this workout totally fueled, but also not overly full? And then how do I have a post-workout recovery meal? It can become very logistically challenging to figure out this one huge meal a day. It can't go right before your workout, but if it goes really far before your workout, you have no peri-workout nutrition at all. So it can get a little bit challenging logistically. So what I like to do is implement a strategy. And like I said, it's certainly not for everybody, but I like to implement a strategy that, in my opinion, kind of gets me the best of both worlds. And so what I do is I will basically do like a protein sparing modified fast until dinner. And what that means is my earlier meals are structured in an extremely protein focused way. So it's either going to be, almost all protein, protein shake, something like that, or it'll be a meal that is just a very lean protein with some fibrous vegetables, right? So maybe you have like an omelet with mostly egg whites, very minimal fat, 1 or 0 yolks, and a bunch of vegetables in there. So all my meals going up toward dinner are going to be almost exclusively protein and maybe some fibrous vegetables in the mix. You might get some trace carbs and fat, outside of that, but generally speaking, we're talking about lean protein and maybe some fibrous vegetables. And so I'll have maybe a breakfast like that, maybe a lunch like that, and then my dinner ultimately becomes my true meal for the day, right? And that's where I have starches, sugars, more fat content. So it's not an extreme macronutrient distribution when you look at the entire day in aggregate. It's just those first couple meals where I'm basically saying, I'm doing one meal a day and just strategically supplementing some protein servings earlier in the day. And of course, you could invert that if you wanted to. You could wake up, have a really big meal, and then just have a couple targeted protein servings later in the day. But I personally like to have dinner as my meal because psychologically that helps me out a lot. Whenever I'm tracking closely with my meals and my calorie intake is a little bit low, I find that psychologically I really dislike situations where I notice early in a day, like, you're running out of calories. Like, to me, it's psychologically very, very comforting to know that I've got this sizable dinner that's coming later in the day, which almost certainly will hold me over till bedtime. So generally speaking, it looks like one meal a day when it comes to that big dinner meal that I like, but I am putting those protein boluses earlier in the day so that I have a little bit of the best of both worlds. Like, those little protein servings don't really feel like a meal. It's just get it in and move on with your day, not focus on food the whole time. For me, it strikes a nice balance here. And I do this flexibly, so let's say that I've got a really big workout and it's occurring before my dinner, or I'm just hungry for the gym, right? Or hungry before the gym. So hungry for the gym and before the gym.
Hungry for the iron, baby.
Exactly. But, you've got a big workout coming up. You're feeling a little bit low on energy, kind of hungry. Research would indicate that you probably don't want to go into a big workout feeling hunger. There's some research indicating that hunger as a sensation itself could impair performance in resistance training sessions. So I don't do this with a super rigid focus, right? So I might have a couple protein boluses early in the day and say, you know what, before this workout, I'm going to have some extra carbs and fat, like a little snack rather than a full meal. I'll go into my workout properly fueled, feeling great, and then have my big dinner afterwards. So I don't do this in a really restrictive or strict way. But in my experience, this has been a really helpful way to kind of find that middle ground where I'm able to cut down on some of the mindless snacking throughout the day, which is something that can really catch up with me personally. I'm less focused on food throughout the day because I'm just kind of treating it like these little strategic protein feedings rather than sitting down and enjoying an entire meal. It does tend to be really time efficient. So like my breakfast and lunch, and sometimes will just be a protein shake, like a ready to drink beverage, which is, extremely time efficient. And yeah, I get an opportunity to enjoy a large meal in the evening that might theoretically take more preparation time. It's kind of my meal for the day where I have to actually put time and effort and focus into cooking and enjoying all those different foods and things like that. And I don't have to stress out about running out of calories super early in the day, or getting to a point where I went a little overboard with my breakfast, and then the whole rest of the day I'm thinking about restricting. So what's really nice about this strategy is you do not necessarily need to deviate from best practices in terms of protein feedings in order to get some of these upsides of that one meal a day approach. Now, the only thing that you're kind of missing out of the purported or perceived benefits of one meal a day is some people really push that idea that like, oh, you got to fast 22 hours a day so that your autophagy is off the charts and you're, all this other stuff. And I simply don't subscribe to that set of ideas. I don't think that they're based on strong evidence. So from my perspective, you're getting the most evidence-supported potential benefits of one meal a day without sacrificing the obvious downsides when it comes to peri-workout nutrition and protein feedings. Have you ever tried something like that?
I have, and I was actually going to comment. Do you know who John Kiefer is, or was he big when you were just like all up in grad school and not paying attention to stuff?
Carb backloading, right?
Yeah. That's what this reminded me of a lot. And I'm not saying that to tar your good name.
Yeah.
I always thought like, oh yeah, this seems like a practically useful strategy. And where Kiefer went astray was being like, yeah, like this is basically magic.
Right.
It will make it impossible for you to store fat due to some reasons that, I as a physicist understand, but you plebes never could. So yeah, I think that it's a very valid practical strategy that maybe has previously been oversold by other people, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have utility.
Yeah. And again, I'm certain, 100% certain that there are a lot of people who would not respond super favorably to this. Like, I have never explicitly, like, I wouldn't say never, but only in rare circumstances do I even bring this up with clients. Mm-hmm. I much prefer to make adjustments based on their pre-existing eating behaviors. And only when we run into a series of obstacles where this seems to be potentially a useful solution, only then do I bring this out. It's not like day one enrollment materials for my coaching services. It's like, hey, guess what? You're on the Trexler eating method, and this is what it is. Yeah. And even I don't use this all that often. Like I said, it's kind of strategically implemented in some very specific circumstances, but I would suggest that it has no physiological benefit compared to a traditional eating pattern. But I would suggest that there are physiological benefits if you compare a strict 1 meal a day strategy versus this kind of modified approach. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I mentioned this, I forgot to bring this up, but I reviewed a study that was looking at 1 meal a day in a fairly recent issue of Mass. And it was a very short-term study, so it's not like you'd say, wow, they lost 6 kilograms of fat-free mass, because like you can only lose so much in like a couple weeks, I forget it was like a 1 or 2 week study timeline. So the body comp numbers, you couldn't do much with them, but a lot of the data within that particular paper were leaning toward some of the intuitive downsides that you would expect from such a disadvantageous protein feeding strategy. So yeah, I would suggest this is physiologically of no benefit relative to a standard feeding window or a standard kind of dietary schedule in terms of meal timing. But I do think that there's considerable benefit when you compare it to strict 1 meal a day eating.
Yeah. I do something similar to that from time to time, but generally just with either carbs or fat, just kind of depending on what I'm hankering for when I'm meal prepping. Sometimes I'll make a big batch of meal prep food that has macro splits that are roughly the macro splits I'm aiming for the day, and then I just eat on that throughout the day. But sometimes I just feel like making higher fat meal prep food, and so I'll eat that earlier in the day and then mostly just eat protein and carbs at night. Or if I want to make a higher carb batch of meal prep, I just eat that earlier in the day and then mostly protein and fat at night. So it's kind of the opposite. Like, I eat what I want to eat earlier in the day and then just kind of compensate for it later. And generally, it's not all protein meals and then protein, carbs, fat meals. It's generally, protein and carbs earlier in the day and protein and fat later at night, or vice versa. Not driven by any assumption that that's physiologically preferable. It's just like, trying to hit my macros, and then what do I want to make for meal prep, and then just work everything else around that. But yeah, I found that to be a pretty practical approach for me as well.
Yeah, and a really important thing, the last thing I'll mention here, is that the underlying psychological processes going on are important. So like if I were going throughout the day saying, I only eat, mostly protein at breakfast and lunch, because actually if you eat carbs for breakfast, you store a lot of fat and you get diabetes. Yeah. Or, I can't eat fat until 1 meal a day because I'll get like heart disease. Like it's not, there is no underlying carb or fat phobia that's baked into this strategy. It's simply just like, you know what? If I sit down for a whole meal here, I might, it'll disrupt me from my workflow, take me out of my day, and I might end up eating, maybe 200 or 300 calories more than I really need to just kind of get my protein in and feel satiated and move on with my day. So it's really just a matter of time efficiency and just finding a way to get that protein in without feeling like I'm going to be snacking on something for the next 90 minutes. So it's purely behavioral, but it's important. If you think that this is going to draw you into some of those potentially problematic psychological processes, then just leave it. It's not for you. You got to find an eating pattern that is completely compatible with your goals, but also kind of your psychological makeup. So what's your coach's corner about?
Yeah, so mine is inspired by a conversation I had yesterday with someone who said, like, yeah, I've been working out a lot more recently. I'm not as young as I once was, and now like one of the issues I'm running into is when I start like an arm workout. Go right into kind of hypertrophy rep ranges for tricep work. And man, my elbows just really don't like that. Used to be fine. Now, it's just creakier than it used to be. And so I gave him some advice, and I was like, this would be decent podcast content. So this is roughly a coach's corner about, about keeping your joints happy if you're a creaky boomer like myself and some of your joints don't like you as much as they once did. So to be clear, I'm not making any claims about injury risk, rehabilitation, anything like that. It's just purely, what might give you slightly more pleasurable perceptual sensations during a training session. If you have, joints that you might colloquially describe as achy or creaky. So this isn't about like, oh, I have an acute muscle strain. How do I train for that? I have a chronic like tendinopathy issue. How do I train around that? So, we're not talking about any of that stuff. Just, whatever. Like my knees are generally fine, but they, if I squat heavy in a workout, they don't like that much. So like, what do I do? So, that's what we're talking about here. And I will admit, I, at least in part, learned this approach from John Meadows. First of all, rest in peace. He was, I think, he was one of my biggest inspirations for just kind of, I would say just like practical training tips. Like there are a lot of people out there in the world who offer one weird trick for X, Y, and Z in the gym. And I try to keep pretty open-minded. And if I see something, even if I think it looks dumb, if it looks fun, I'll try it. And I got to say, a lot of those one weird tricks that people throw out seem to have a very poor signal-to-noise ratio. Like it's something that's unique just for the sake of being unique, but doesn't really seem to do what it's supposed to, doesn't really seem to work that well. But I would recommend looking back through John Meadows' content. I think his one weird tricks that he threw out did have a very excellent signal to noise ratio. He'd be like, yeah, just like try this weird series of exercises or like particular exercise for your lats. Like, I promise it's going to blow him up. And I'd be like, John, that looks, no. But then I try it. I'd be like, God damn it, John, you're a genius. So anyway, I cribbed this in part from him. Because, he spent a lot of his time kind of in the public eye of the fitness industry in his 40s and later. So his joints weren't as young as they previously had been. But one of the hallmarks of his training approach, like if you'd watch a lot of his training videos, is he would train heavy and he would train really hard. And so one of the things he was trying to accomplish is like, how can I do that while keeping my joints as happy with me as they can be? And so the strategy he came up with, which is very simple, but in my experience works really well, is whatever joint you're about to train the muscles around that generally doesn't like you, just start with I don't know the best wording for this, but just kind of like a non-stressful pump type exercise. So It's not something that's going to take you through any sort of like extreme stretch. It's not going to take, any of your tissues close to their tensile limits, and you're just going to do high reps with it. And importantly, I don't know why this matters, but it seems to matter. You want to do it for both sides of the joint. So for example, if you were going to do some triceps training, you'd want to do something for your triceps, but also your biceps, just to kind of warm up everything around your elbow joint. And when I say kind of like a non-stressful type lift, you wouldn't want to do skull crushers where you're, taking your elbows into full flexion under heavy load. Nothing like that. So, it might be something like rope pushdowns. You're just going to start with a couple sets, or even just one set of 20-30 reps, relatively close to failure, of a triceps exercise. Repeat the process with a biceps exercise. And then from there, you can start moving into heavier stuff. So, that's when you might want to get into your skull crushers for sets of 8 to 12, or, really any other triceps exercise. And don't know why this works, but it works quite well. Your tendons seem to be happier, your joints seem to be happier. And one other additional little wrinkle that I would add to this is, so step one, do kind of high rep pump type work across both sides of the joint. Step two, just kind of train normally after that. And then step three, I think, at least I personally experience dividends from ending my training with kind of what I would call like a stretchy type movement. So, you are now looking for something that is going to take that joint through a full range of motion. And you're generally going to do like paused reps where you can really kind of let your muscles like sink into it, like feel a good stretch in the muscle, and do that to end with. So let's see. An example of how this could work is, let's say you have creaky knees. So you're going to start your like knee dominant lower body training, maybe with just some light knee extensions. And then, very important, don't forget, next thing you're going to do is leg curls, warm up your hamstrings as well. And then from there, move into your heavier normal type training, and then something to kind of stretch your quads to end with. One of my go-tos for this is split squats, but generally when you do like rear leg elevated split squats, you're trying to train the front leg, the leg that's down. So you try to keep most of your weight shifted forward, but to get a really good stretch in your quads to end with, you want to try to keep a lot of your weight back. So you're keeping a good amount of the weight on your back leg, and for every rep, you're going to go down. You're going to hold that bottom position of the rear leg elevated split squat, squeeze the glute on the back leg, try to get your hips forward, stretch out your quads and hip flexors really well, and then to initiate the drive up, you're going to drive your front heel through the floor, but you're also going to kick into the bench. So it's almost like you're doing a knee extension with your back leg as you're doing kind of a squatting pattern with your front leg. For the stretchy movement you end on, you also don't want that to be super heavy. Like you want it to be something where you can focus more on the stretch than am I strong enough just to complete the reps. But yeah, that approach, so the approach I'm generally describing probably isn't, strictly speaking, ideal for strength. So, powerlifters listening to this might be hearing me and saying like, oh no, like if I did a couple sets of 20 to 30 reps, relatively close to failure for like a pump type triceps exercise, my bench training that comes after, like I might have to take 5-10% off my training loads. And like, yeah, you probably will. And that's another, again, for the purpose of like trying to keep your joints happy. If you can stress all of your target muscles just as hard, but not have to expose them to quite as much load, that might be preferable. So like, yeah, this is just kind of, it's advice for people who are trying to stay in the gym, trying to still train hard, but maybe not necessarily for the sole purpose of maximizing strength performance at all costs. So like it comes with trade-offs. This is more talking about kind of just like hypertrophy and quote unquote like general health type resistance training. But yeah, I do. My training looks a lot more like this a lot of the time these days. Especially like I said, my friend asked me about like a creaky elbow. Like this is how I do all of my arm and upper body training now. My elbows used to be basically bulletproof, like nothing ever bothered them. And then I broke my arm last year, and ever since then, my left elbow just doesn't like me as much as it used to. So yeah, I take an approach very similar to this now, and it's been huge for me because like previously after an upper body training day, like my left elbow would hurt during training and it would hurt the day after training. But now like I approach my upper body training this way. My elbow does not hurt during training, does not hurt after training. It's good stuff. So, you know, that's my little coach's corner. So just to reiterate, step 1, pump type work, both sides of the joint. If you're talking about the elbows, biceps, and triceps, you're talking about the hips, maybe start with something like body weight or very light hip thrusts, and then also maybe some leg raises, like something for the hip flexors and the abs. For the knees, you're talking about both quads and hamstrings, like so some sort for shoulders, or like chest training, maybe start with flies, but again, you don't want to take it to an extreme in range of motion. So, you know, like high rep flies, stopping before you get that stretch. And then maybe if you want to do more stretchy flies, do that at the end of your workout. So you might want to start with both flies and rear delt raises if you're talking about warming up your shoulders for chest training. So that's step 1, just high rep pump training across both sides of the joint. Then just train like normal and then end with some sort of kind of strength exercise that allows you to really sink into a stretch for whatever muscle you just trained to end your training. To be clear, I don't want to make any physiological claims about how this is going to affect the structure or function of any particular soft tissue, not making any prehab or rehab claims or anything like that. Just in general, if this is a problem you're dealing with, tends to feel nice. And training when you feel nice is good.
Yeah, it's when you start, I was Googling something as you were talking because this got me thinking. I was like, you know, back in the day, around 2012, 2013, I started doing hamstring curls before my squats. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I think I might have got that from John Meadows.
You probably did.
And so I was Googling it, and I did.
Yeah.
And I was looking at an article he wrote about it. And in the article, he said in 2 different spots, and this was a short article.
I don't know why it works.
I don't know why it works, and I do not have scientific evidence.
Yeah.
This is not science.
Yeah.
This is shit I do that feels good.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important thing in like the whole evidence-based fitness world is like, it is okay. Like there's nothing wrong with saying like, hey, this is like something that is not dangerous, is not deleterious. It seems to work nice, and I don't have scientific evidence for it.
Yeah.
Do with that what you will.
No, like that's something that I've talked about a lot before. Like I think, like, I mean, the key, for example, earlier in this episode is a great example of that. Like, I think a lot of people get themselves in trouble because they are unwilling to have the intellectual humility to say, like, hey, this thing seems good. Like it's a practical approach that seems to work for me. And, you know, if you're having similar problems to the ones I'm having, maybe it's worth you experimenting with it as well. Like that's a perfectly valid thing to say. It's a very intellectually honest way to approach things where there's not a ton of conclusive evidence one way or the other, or just not any direct research at all. And I think people are are unwilling to do that because they maybe think it makes them sound dumb or like less serious, or they think that people won't take their advice as seriously unless they make it seem like everything they say has a ton of supporting evidence. But no, I think it's important to be able to be honest about what level of evidence supports the things you say. And if it is just purely anecdotal, just say, this shit's anecdotal. Seems nice. But yeah, like the carb night stuff. If Kiefer just came out and said like, yeah, man, like if you're struggling with like food fixation through the day and controlling your total calorie intake, mostly just eat protein through the day, try eating some carbs at night. Seems to work pretty well for me. Give it a shot. I don't think anyone would have been upset about it, but that was a very controversial dietary approach because he went out on a limb and said like, yes, like this is going to be magical for these reasons. And it was just like completely bullshit, like massively over extrapolated, like basic physiology stuff that didn't actually support the claims he was making. And like, I feel that same way about like paleo stuff. Like, as far as kind of like popular fad diets go, the general dietary approach that paleo folks recommend is perfectly reasonable. It's like, mostly stick to unprocessed foods when possible. I mean, there are so many different schools of paleo, but like that's basically it. Like that's perfectly reasonable dietary advice. But then when they say, and this is going to work the best for performance, for health, for everything, because like this is what we evolved to eat. And then like more anthropological and paleontological evidence comes out showing like, oh yeah, the way you said Paleolithic people ate, yeah, you're full of shit. They didn't eat that. Like then paleo folks have egg on their face because it's like, oh yeah, you said this thing is good for these reasons. Turns out the reasons are wrong and you're an idiot. But like the general advice they're giving is often like decent advice. Yeah. And if they just stuck with the decent advice of like, if possible, eat less processed foods. Well, I guess that's not the best example because there is like direct evidence on eating less processed foods, but like you get my point.
Yeah.
Just be honest about the level of evidence you have supporting something. And in my case, for my Coach's Corner segment, I don't have evidence other than feels nice for me. Seemed like it felt nice for John Meadows. Maybe it will feel nice for you.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, there's just like some little qualifiers. This whole approach of like, it works for me, I'm going to go ahead and recommend it to people. Like, it's important to accurately present the amount of support or lack of support for that idea. It's important that the idea does not have reasonable potential to be harmful or deleterious, right? So it's very different to say like, hey, like you're probably going to be pretty good in terms of your dietary goals if you generally pick stuff from this whole genre of foods versus like, just straight up orthorexia inducing propaganda, right? The second you deviate from the paleo foods, like you're going to get sick, dude. Like that's really bad.
Yeah.
Like, so there's a fine line between, it's gotta be stuff that doesn't have potential to be truly deleterious or harmful. But also, like, the thing that drives me nuts about anecdotes that are shared in this context is, again, when people just are unable to say, like, hey, this is anecdotal. Like, when people take these anecdotes and then just reach for the closest science available and say, actually, this is evidence-based science that I'm giving you. It's like, yeah, it's not, though. So as long as people are kind of putting out the right caveats and not recommending things that are reckless, like this kind of anecdotal stuff certainly has a place in filling in the gaps with the way we approach training and nutrition.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say it even goes like maybe even a step beyond that, because something that I have observed happening, and I don't feel like doing that. I'm not going to name specific people or call out like specific concepts where I've seen this, but a not uncommon dynamic that I see from time to time is maybe someone does make an initial claim that they make in a circumspect and intellectually honest way. They say like, hey, I tried this thing, worked pretty well for me. Maybe you give it a shot too if you're experiencing similar things. And, so the first iteration of it is totally good. And then, they have a reasonably large audience and, some portion of those people try out that piece of advice. And then, this individual maybe posts about the same thing again. And I don't have one specific person in mind. Like this is a pattern I've witnessed multiple times across multiple different topics. But yeah, so the original poster like posts something again, like, hey, this thing I posted about a couple weeks ago, still doing it, still seems to be pretty nice for me. And then in their comment section, you see quite a few comments of people in their audience saying like, oh yeah, like that's awesome. I tried it too, and you were right. This is awesome. It works so well. And like maybe you see one or two dissenters, but it's like mostly very positive feedback. Like, yeah, dude, like you're absolutely on the right track here. That was great advice. And then over time, it kind of morphs from, hey, I tried this thing and it felt nice, to I recommended this thing. Hundreds of people have tried it, and it seems like almost universally it's incredible for them. So, there's not like a scientific study on it, but look at all of this like real world in the trenches evidence. Like this thing, like it's a sure thing. Like the amount of positive stories about this is just overwhelming at this point. And I can certainly understand why someone would go that route. But I would caution against it if you, dear listener, are ever in this situation, for a couple reasons. One is that most of the time, like even if you don't do this intentionally, like you tend to attract people to you who have similar characteristics to you. So just kind of like by default, if you recommend something to your audience, your audience is probably more similar to you than they would be to a random sample of the general population. And so something that maybe, say, only works for a minority of people, and you being in that minority, people in your audience are probably also disproportionately likely to be in that minority. So just from the jump, you're not starting with a representative sample. And two, it can become a thing where if you talk about something frequently, people for whom that thing works well will tend to gravitate towards you. Just, because people like being told that they're right about things and don't like being told that they're wrong about things. So, if people try your advice and it doesn't work well for them, they'll probably just stop following you over time. So you'll get less negative feedback from them. And as other people try this stuff and, it works well for them, they'll be more likely to follow you. So as you promote an idea, just kind of through the natural flow of people through social networks, you will accrue an audience that is even less representative than it was previously. That's like basically cherry picked to make everything you say sound really good. And so, yeah, like the observation that, hey, I put this out in the world and it seems to work for a lot of people, that may be true, but that's still not good evidence that it works for most people. Because like over time, like you unintentionally build an echo chamber, like whether you mean to or not. So, yeah, if you ever see that dynamic in play on social media, just kind of keep that in mind. And if you're listening to this and you're like an influencer with a sizable audience and you ever start kind of like feeling this dynamic taking place, following advice you give within your audience, also keep this in mind and try to be a bit more circumspect about it.
Good advice.
Yeah.
All right. I want to drop a little bit of the good stuff here, some science, breaking out of more of the applied anecdotal realm. I do want to briefly touch on one topic that is going to specifically dive into some research. I'm going to address like half of a Q&A. So one of the things that comes up all the time in Q&As is basically, hey, I'm going to diet and I don't want to lose lean mass and I don't want to lose strength. What should I do? And I think that, I think we've covered the nutrition side of that pretty extensively over the years of articles and podcasting. If you go to strongerbyscience.com/diet, there's a very comprehensive look into it. But the basics on the nutrition side are pretty straightforward. You want to retain lean mass. You want to retain your performance to the best of your ability. Certainly, you want to make sure you're eating enough protein spread across, somewhere between 3 to 6 servings per day, ideally. You don't want to go too fast with your weight loss, somewhere between 0.25 to 1% of body weight per week. And the leaner or the more advanced you are as a lifter, or the more concerned you are about lean mass losses, the more you would err toward a slower rate of weight loss. So 1% of body weight per week could be totally fine for lean mass retention if you've got plenty of body fat to lose. You're kind of beginner to intermediate with your lifting, eating plenty of protein. If you are, elite natural bodybuilder, absolutely shredded toward the end of your prep, you do not want to be losing 1% of body weight per week. That is very likely to start getting into a range that's a little bit too quick based on the context. So that's the nutrition and rate of weight loss side, which is fairly straightforward. Garth and colleagues in 2011, that's one of the classic papers demonstrating how going a little bit too fast with your weight loss in really high level athletes can start to impair, changes in body composition, changes in performance. When it comes to training, this is something we've talked about on the podcast before. And I want to frame it as a very specific problem statement, because this is how a lot of people approach it. So I'm not cutting yet. I'm about as strong as I've ever been. I'm performing well, fueling my workouts. Everything's going well.
Congrats, dude.
Yeah, thank you. And right now, for some random exercise, I'm able to do 4 sets of 8 with about 200 pounds. And that might fluctuate day to day. It might be a slight positive, trajectory because I'm doing progressive overload.
And not everyone can do delt raises with that much weight, but Eric's a freak. So
exactly,
this is just his personal example.
Dude, speaking of that, I saw a video on Instagram the other day. Have you ever seen Bo Jackson's first hit in the major leagues?
No.
Dude, he hits a crisp chopper to the gap between first and second base.
Mm-hmm.
The second baseman fields it cleanly. Bo runs it out.
Whew.
It's just a freaking chopper to the second baseman. No one's like fumbling to cover the base. He just runs out a hard hit to the second baseman.
That's ridiculous.
An infield hit.
Bo knows baseball.
I thought it was a doctored video, honestly. I checked. But anyway, so I'm able to do 4x8 with 200 pounds. As this cut progresses, most likely there's going to be a point where I can no longer do 4 sets of 8 with 200 pounds, depending on how aggressive the cut is and how much ground I'm trying to cover. But I might get to a point where now if I'm using 200 pounds, I'm only able to do 8 and then 6 and then 5 and 5, instead of 8, 8, 8, 8. So a lot of people within that problem statement say, what's my best strategy here? Should I, for example, reduce set volume? Am I trying to do too many sets in my workouts? And it's, because I have lower recovery capacity. Should I keep the load that I'm using, and instead of trying to do sets of 8, maybe I'm trying to do sets of 6, So should I keep trying to do 4 sets of 8 with the same relative difficulty and drop the load? So instead of doing 4x8 with 200, now I'm doing it with 185 and it's going okay. So the question is, what do I do here to most effectively preserve my strength or preserve my fat-free mass? And specifically with this, I want to talk about fat-free mass. So should I be dropping the rep range a little bit? Should I be dropping some set volume? Should I be dropping the load to make this a little bit more feasible? This is a question we've talked about before, and we've mentioned how we're both kind of a bit surprised that there's simply not direct research on this that we're aware of.
Yeah.
That really specifically shows if you're cutting, here is the blueprint for managing your training variables to best retain muscle mass or fat-free mass. Like, to our knowledge, that doesn't exist.
Yeah, we don't even have one blueprint, and in other fields they have the blueprint 2, the blueprint 3.
Perfect.
We're really behind in this area.
So yeah, we've talked about this before on the show. We've said, listen, if you want an evidence-based statement, I don't have much for you. If you want kind of a practical applied statement that involves some speculation, my personal approach in this situation is I generally, as a cut starts getting really brutal, I start to reduce my repetition ranges a little bit, and I start to cut my set volume a little bit, especially for some of the ancillary kind of, my assistance exercises or my auxiliary exercises. Mm-hmm. Because what I notice is, first of all, you start getting, like, let's say the experience I'm drawing on here is deep into a contest prep. I don't have the glycogen to give you a good set of, certainly not to give you 4 good sets of 12, right? It's not there. I'm cutting, my carbs are low, it's just gone. And so in that context, I like to drop my rep ranges so that I can at least lean harder on my phosphocreatine system, and my glaring lack of glycogen won't become quite as apparent in my performance of my exercises. So I like to make my rep ranges a little bit more compatible with the energy systems that I can still kind of reliably lean on. I drop my set volume because, like, if you've ever had a high volume program, you start to know when you're getting into what some people would colloquially call junk volume, where at a certain point you're like, why am I still in the gym? Like, this is kind of nonsense what I'm doing here.
Yeah.
When you're deep into prep, you reach that point pretty early in a workout. If you try to maintain the same number of exercises and sets, and if you keep everything the same, that point where you start to say, am I actually doing anything here? It comes a lot earlier in the workout. So for that reason, I like to drop my set volume a little bit so that I'm being as efficient as I can with really high quality effort in the gym. Mm-hmm. And there is some evidence to suggest that when it comes to gains in fat-free mass and muscle mass, the volume it took to build that muscle may not necessarily be as much as it takes to maintain that muscle. There have been fairly long-term longitudinal trials where they have a muscle building phase where they gain some muscle with a relatively higher volume program, and they can actually maintain it pretty effectively when they cut that volume down a little bit, as long as intensity remains high. Mm-hmm. So for that cluster of reasons, my general approach, which I would not say is like conclusively the best way to do it, but the way that I find most favorable is to trim my repetition ranges a little bit and cut my set volume a little bit, especially for some of the less critical exercises in my program. But one of the reasons I wanted to address this topic is because there was recently a systematic review by Roth and colleagues, and it's called Lean Mass Sparing in Resistance Trained Athletes During Caloric Restriction, the Role of Resistance Training Volume. And one of the reasons I wanted to get into this is because it kind of takes the form of a bit of a systematic review. So they mentioned that they did like a systematic literature search and kind of dive into this topic in a general sense. And I don't want it to seem like I'm being super critical of the paper, right? So in terms of just like writing a review paper, they bring up some interesting perspectives. They discuss it in a thorough way. They talk about some mechanisms. They present a perspective that isn't 100% compatible with the perspective that I just shared, but that's okay. Like I said, when there's a lack of direct evidence, there are going to be conflicting opinions that are, in many cases, all justifiable. As long as they're based on something, they can be justified. The reason I wanted to bring up this paper, though, is it does kind of take the form of a systematic review, and I think a lot of people might take the conclusion from it and say, oh, damn, this is high level evidence on the hierarchy of evidence. So the hierarchy of evidence, we've talked about it before, I believe, on the podcast, but it's basically a way of organizing different types of observations and published research and saying which of these carries more weight, which of these has higher quality of evidence and lower risk of bias. And so you start with like kind of an editorial or a narrative review, which is just somebody who's writing a paper and saying, I've got some shit I want to say about this topic, and I'm going to say it. And that's pretty much the entire set of guardrails for a narrative review.
Yeah.
You just write some stuff. If the reviewers like it, hey, that's science, baby.
I'm going to throw out a hot take that I've mentioned on the podcast before, and I still stand by it. A narrative review is a blog post.
Yes.
Yeah. That two people signed off on.
And in a blog that's very hard to edit.
Correct.
Yeah, not easy to make a quick update. Sorry, I had a typo.
Yeah.
That'll be fixed in 9 months.
Yeah.
And I'll have to issue a big apology.
Yeah, and the fact that you made a typo will forever be in the erratum section of your CV, so maybe there are structural incentives against ever making corrections, but
yeah,
whatever.
So we've got those, and then we've got mechanistic studies, maybe in rodents and a cell culture.
Yeah.
Where we start to understand how stuff works, but it may not generalize to a person, a living human being.
Also, sorry, just to make clear, I don't want to make it sound like I'm throwing shade at narrative reviews, because I'm not throwing shade at blog posts. I'm a blogger. I think blogs can be good. I just think that, once you start getting into the realm of narrative reviews, the presumed bright line between published research and blogging gets very fuzzy. But yeah, there are a lot of tremendously valuable narrative reviews, and I don't want to make it sound like I don't think there are.
We've both been in the situation where we like write a blog post and someone's like, hey, why don't you submit this to a journal so it actually matters and counts? And we're like, I mean, I've published narrative reviews. I would have written this the same way. They just would have told me to like write in a more passive tone.
Yeah.
This is what the article would have been.
And it would have gotten 1/20th as many reads.
Exactly, yeah. But anyway, so we've got those narrative reviews, then we've got mechanistic studies, and then case studies or case reports, moving up to cross-sectional studies, up to case control studies, into cohort studies, and then into randomized controlled trials, where we're actually able to experimentally control some of these variables and do, really well-controlled interventions where we can start making some pretty nice claims about causation with a decent level of confidence. And then at the top of this hierarchy, that's where we start to find systematic reviews and meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials. They are at the top of the hierarchy, which suggests they have the highest quality of evidence and the lowest risk of bias. But it's really important to recognize that this hierarchy of evidence is basically a heuristic. It's a general indicator of how we make sense of different types of research, but it does not mean that the first time a systematic review that puts forward a conclusion comes out like, oh, well, glad we solved that. Now we've answered it. So my concern is that since this recent paper seems kind of like a systematic review and has a systematic literature search and study coding and all that stuff, that people are going to say, oh, damn, I guess we answered this question. That's great. Because I think when we call something a systematic review, it assigns a particular weight to it that we have to be very cautious about when we're interpreting. So, for example, I was looking at a paper by Garg and colleagues, and this was from a study on, or from a journal that's focused on renal, like kidney research. And a little clip that I saw in there was they were talking about systematic reviews being good, but they also mentioned, however, important methodologic flaws of systematic reviews have been well described. And for example, of the 86 renal systematic reviews published in 2005, 58% had important methodologic flaws. So they are systematic reviews. So you look at the title, you look at the abstract and say, oh, damn, this is the highest level of evidence. But that does not mean that, You just look for the closest systematic review, look for the conclusion, and that's that. You've got your answer. So they did provide, which I thought was really helpful, a checklist for questions to ask when you're assessing the quality of a systematic review. 1, was the review conducted according to a pre-specified protocol? 2, was the question focused and well-formulated, the research question? 3, were the right types of studies eligible for the review? 4, was the method of identifying all relevant information comprehensive? So, for example, is it likely that they missed some relevant studies, or that perhaps they didn't consider publication bias? Number 5, was the data abstraction from each study appropriate? Were the methods used in each individual study appraised and actually, considered in the synthesis of this information? And then number 6, along those lines, was the information synthesized and summarized appropriately? And was it even reasonable to kind of lump these things together in the first place, whether that's qualitative or quantitative in terms of how this evidence is lumped together and synthesized to form conclusions? So you might be wondering, Eric, why are we digging into the text of a renal journal? What the hell are we talking about here?
Well, I'm not going to lie. As the co-host, I have forgotten what the main topic of this segment was already.
Yes. So again, we're talking about how am I supposed to train in order to retain lean mass during a cut?
Yes.
And my concern is that people will see this paper and say, oh, that's a systematic review. That settles that. That's the highest level of evidence. We're all good. It's critically important to recognize that this is a systematic review of 0 randomized controlled trials that directly answer that question.
Yeah.
So despite the fact that you say, oh, systematic review, high level evidence, a systematic review can only provide informative answers when the studies involved directly, provide evidence related to that research question.
Yeah. In theory, the sum of a systematic review is at least related to the whole of its parts, where, right. If there's a lot of high quality evidence in an area, a systematic review that, one, makes the readers aware of all of the evidence in the area and does a really good job synthesizing it, can add a tremendous amount of value. But, if there's not that, a systematic review may be able to add value to effectively nothing, but the upper limits of the additive value it can provide is necessarily constrained.
Yeah. So the reason I bring all this stuff up is the topic at hand of, how should I be adjusting these training variables during cutting to preserve lean mass has not really been directly studied. And I think the researchers, like I said, they wrote a nice paper. They went into a lot of interesting topics, presented the evidence well, but this is not, in the strictest terms, a systematic review investigating that question, because there aren't, the underlying data do not directly address that question. You could theoretically get at it indirectly if you could look at this group of studies from the review and say, yeah, the only real major thing differentiating these studies is the way that they adjusted these particular training variables, in this case, training volume. So you'd have to have some degree of confidence that there are not major confounding factors, other important factors from these studies that are influencing the conclusions drawn. So in this case, my primary concerns about whether or not this paper directly addresses the question is the research question itself was a little bit ambiguous. They talked a lot about volume as a mechanism of preserving lean mass, but there were some studies looking at high volume versus low volume programs, and other studies looking at increasing volume over time versus decreasing volume over time. So the amount of absolute volume versus relative change in volume, there were kind of these dueling research questions that were intermingled a little bit. Some of the terms, such as reducing and increasing training volume, weren't really defined very explicitly in quantifiable terms, which made categorizing them a little bit difficult. And so, for example, in one instance, a a paper was categorized as a volume reduction study, it had 2 training blocks, and training volume went up over time from block 1 to block 2, but it was considered a volume reduction study because there was a deload between the blocks. And they said because volume went down in the deload, that is a volume reduction program, even though overall volume did go up over time. There was a mixture of studies with participants of different training status. So for example, looking at, and just the magnitude of weight loss changed a lot. So in some cases, they were hoping to make inferences about how training volume impacts the loss of lean mass while cutting, but they're comparing a very modest amount of weight loss in relatively untrained folks or moderately trained folks versus a case study of a bodybuilder cutting it for a show, getting shredded.
Yeah.
So we're talking about losing a couple kilograms when you've got plenty of kilograms to lose versus getting absolutely shredded. And fat-free mass loss in contest prep is the rule, not the exception. When we look at the case studies on male bodybuilders cutting for shows, drug tested, fat-free mass losses are usually observed and often quite substantial. Another example is, looking at short-term changes in fat-free mass with a mixture of keto studies and non-keto studies. Obviously, based on the randomized controlled trials, with keto studies, you're going to expect in the first few weeks that we have an initial drop in fat-free mass that is largely due to a drop in water and glycogen, most likely.
Yeah.
So all of that is to say, I think I wanted to get out ahead of the idea that this is now a settled question because there's a systematic review on it. I'm not trying to, diminish the effort of the authors because, like I said, I think the paper as a narrative review very much accomplishes what a narrative review would want to do. It says, hey, here's this question. We don't have direct evidence. Let's try to piece together some related studies and see if we can draw some inferences for now and basically generate hypotheses. So I think it was an excellent paper for generating hypotheses, but I think it does lend itself to some misinterpretation because it is kind of framed as a systematic review. So getting back to it, I kind of mentioned how I like to approach training when I'm cutting. That is a loosely evidence-informed, speculative approach. I think it's rooted in ideas that come from evidence, but I can't call it an evidence-based statement, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I would encourage people to reserve judgment and not just say, well, there's a systematic review. Looks like the answer is clear now. I don't think that's the case, but I do appreciate and commend the authors for, if nothing else, bringing awareness to the fact like there is no direct research on this, and it is an extremely applicable question. So my hope is that researchers are going to see this and say, hey, we ought to do a randomized controlled trial and start getting to the bottom of this.
Yeah.
All right. What do you got to close out the show here? Do you want to do your random segment?
Yeah. So this is a segment that, wouldn't fit under any of the general classifications we use on the show. It's certainly not a research review, not a research roundup, not really a coach's corner. So yeah, just random segments. We'll call this the shout out segments.
Well, this is we're revisiting a segment that we tried and swiftly abandoned.
It's not really. Yeah. So we used to have a segment called On the Rise where I would ask people to, let me know if there were people coming up on social media who maybe weren't getting as much attention as they deserved, and to send those people in, and I'd check out their content, and if it was good, shout them out. That was abandoned for a couple of reasons. One was that there was very little audience participation. People didn't send in as many folks as I expected them to. Two, there were very clear campaigns that occurred where, someone who listens to our podcast would tell their audience like, oh, yeah, suggest me. And like some of those people were fine. Some of them I was like, why do you listen to our podcast? And then the third and probably most important factor is I'm very lazy. And so one of the issues I ran into early on was I was like, well, how much of this person's content do I need to review? Because if it's like the 5 most recent posts. Like I can do that, but if someone maybe had like a real stinker, like not even that far back, like 15 posts back or something, who'd be like, well, I don't know if I want to go this route. And I'll tell you the thing that really killed it was COVID, because a lot of people who were giving good advice in the fitness realm were giving more questionable advice in other contexts. And I was like, yep, I'm shelving this segment.
The fitness and virology sectors kind of merged there for a minute.
Yeah. So,
and one of the things that like kind of what you're alluding to with one of those points is like when you like, I have certainly no reservations about saying like, oh man, look at this great article. This is a great article. Everyone should read this article, or check out this video. This is very nice. But when you're kind of recommending
a person,
yeah, it's like could be perceived as essentially a blank check.
Yeah.
And like, it's like, yeah, I'm sure that they've never said anything that's terrible. They've never had content that is like just indefensibly incorrect.
Now that you mention that, memories are flooding back to me about how that segment went. And I remember I started giving all of those caveats, and I fear that it came across as like, wow, this person's fitness stuff is decent, but they're probably a shitty person.
Yeah,
so.
Sordid history.
But yeah, it was just like, I mean, I basically had to say, this person seems to have good fitness content, but I can't vouch for them as a person, which like is completely honest, but also
it implies that it's like, oh man.
And like I wasn't trying to imply that, but I don't know how to state that in a way that wouldn't potentially carry that implication. So yeah, it got away from that segment. So this is not a return of On the Rise, because all of these people are already
they have risen.
Yeah, they're well established, but I wanted to give some shout outs to people who are out there on social media doing great work, and like putting out good information in a sea awash with disinformation and misinformation, who I think that our audience doesn't have a ton of overlap with. So like I think that our audience has quite a bit of overlap with like Eric Helms and Omar's audience, and the Iron Culture podcast audience, the Barbell Medicine audience. I think we have a lot of overlap with like Andy Morgan's audience. But there are people who I follow who I don't see mentioned as frequently in kind of Stronger by Science groups and channels. Who I think more of you guys should probably be following. And so the person I'm going to lead off with, and what actually inspired this segment, is in the most recent Q&A threads, someone asked what we thought about Ben Patrick, who is also known on Instagram as Knees Over Toes Guy. Like, does he put out good information, or is he a fraud? And I was like, you know what? Guy actually puts out solid information. Don't want to just talk about him, so let's just kind of make a segment out of this. But yeah, so I'll start with him, Ben Patrick, otherwise known as Knees Over Toes Guy. And I think that he's a bit controversial, not due to the information he presents, but due to the way that he presents it. So I do think that he tends to be a bit hyperbolic in his presentation. He'll say like, oh yeah, like here's this approach to training to improve knee health and resiliency, and this is super revolutionary stuff. No one else is doing this. And that's kind of like the selling point. Like, here's this cutting edge shit that I'm on and no one else is. And that might be like slightly overstating how hyperbolic he is, but that's like kind of the tone. And like that bit isn't true. Like most of the stuff he's recommending is just good, solid, evidence-based info that physical therapists and rehab professionals have been using for years. But he packages it and presents it in a way that is interesting, engaging, and informative for the general public, who may otherwise not want to do some of that stuff. Because, like when it comes to kind of like rehab exercises, unless you have some sort of serious injury or like major pre-existing issue, it's easy to look at that stuff and be like, no, like that's boring. I just want to go squat heavy. And so it's sometimes hard to convince people to do things that would be good for them. And I think that he's very good at that. So he's putting out solid information in a way that maybe is a bit hyperbolic, but the quality of the information and the advice he gives is generally quite high. So yeah, he is certainly worth a follow. Moving on, the next person I'd recommend is Ben Carpenter. So he talks about all sorts of subjects, but I think what he's probably most well known for is calling out and debunking bad information that's going around social media. And there are a lot of people who do that, but I think that Ben is particularly good at it, both in terms of making his points in a concise and informative way, and in a way that's often quite funny. So, if that's something that interests you, he is a very solid follow. Moving on, I mentioned I think that our audience has quite a bit of overlap with barbell medicine. The person I'm going to recommend is now a barbell medicine coach, but I started following her when she was not. So I still think of her as kind of her own thing. And, not to imply that if you coach for a company, you are now just that company. You've been absorbed into the Borg. But yeah, whatever. I'm just rambling at this point. Clear as eye.
Yeah, we let our coaches have interests. We let them spend time with their families. They don't just like become, part of the company. They still function independently as people.
To some extent, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, so Claire Zai is a very solid follow on social media, Instagram particularly. Like I said, she's a coach for barbell medicine these days, and she puts out really good information just about training in general. Like she tends to be pretty focused on that, and also female-specific issues around strength training. So a lot of stuff about the menstrual cycle in particular. So she's a very, very solid follow. And last but certainly not least, Emma Storey-Gordon, who... I don't know. I think that our spheres used to overlap quite a bit more, and now they don't. But yeah, she's a tremendous follow, mostly on Instagram giving weight loss advice, and there are plenty of people on Instagram giving weight loss advice, but I think that she's particularly good at it because most of the information she gives is very evidence-based and practical, without being off-puttingly sciencey. And by that I mean, I recognize that this podcast probably not this episode of this podcast, but by and large, this podcast is probably off-puttingly sciencey for some non-trivial percentage of people. So, if you wanted to recommend folks for advice to, someone in your family who doesn't know anything about resistance training, it's like, follow these people for good practical advice. Maybe you wouldn't recommend our podcast because you're like, yeah, these guys, the stuff they're saying might like go over people's heads. So what Emma's really good at is she's good at giving like science-based recommendations and advice in a way that won't go over people's heads. And yeah, so it's very practical. And also she tends to present things in a way that is kind of more empathetic and less judgmental than you will often see from people who do focus a lot on giving weight loss advice. So yeah, she is a very solid follow as well. Would strongly recommend.
So when you say that she's not off-puttingly sciencey, does that mean she will not read you 6 points on how to appraise a systematic review?
Yeah, probably so. But yeah, I mean, like she knows her stuff. Like there's different forms of science communication, and she definitely does a different form of scientific communication than we do.
One might say better.
One might.
That's okay.
Yeah.
All right, so that's a great list. Hopefully people will check them out. What do you have to play us out?
Yeah, so to play us out has recently just turned into a media review and recommendation segment. But I got another good one this week, and that is a Hulu show called Under the Banner of Heaven. It is based on I believe, 2003 John Krakauer book by the same name. And the book is about some murders that took place in the Mormon community, and also delving into, some of maybe the less talked about aspects of the history of Mormonism. And the show is very much following kind of the same line. It's starring Andrew Garfield, who does a tremendous job. It's a very well acted show. I think it's going to be 6 episodes maybe, and we're through episode 3 or 4. So far it's really good. I'm less concerned about this show sticking the landing, because I know it comes from a book, and they don't have to worry about how it's going to wrap up, because it's a real story. And also, I want to make clear with this recommendation, I got nothing but love for most Mormons. I don't like it's a piece of media that could be interpreted as just critical of Mormonism in and of itself. We're not out here on this podcast trying to start religious conflict. Think most Mormons, very cool. It's just a good piece of media. And I also imagine most Mormons would probably not be fans of the particular branch of Mormonism that is really put under the microscope in this particular piece of media. But anyway, it's a great show called Under the Banner of Heaven, and if that sounds good to you, you should check it out.
I don't want to. I know you're going to be upset. I don't have a show recommendation this week.
Damn, I'm shocked.
I normally do, but
no, you don't.
This week I'm stumped. No, I watch a new show. We've discussed it before, once every several years. So I'm kind of planning my next move and waiting for the right time. But I have no idea what the next one's going to be. You know what I do have an idea of? What? The next episode we're going to release, which is going to be 1 week from today.
What a segue.
It's a great segue. As always, thank you for listening, and we will see you next time. Thank you for listening to the Stronger by Science podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, be sure to sign up for our free newsletter to get concise breakdowns of relevant research, as well as 28 free training programs for all skill levels and all schedules. We hate spam just as much as you do, so we'll only email you when we have something really interesting to share with you. You can sign up for the free newsletter at strongerbyscience.com/newsletter, or just go to the Stronger by Science homepage and click the free programs button at the top. If you want to join in on the Stronger by Science podcast conversation, be sure to check out our Facebook group and our subreddit. The links for both are provided in the description of today's episode. Finally, please remember that we are not medical doctors or registered dietitians. So, before you make any changes to your exercise or nutrition habits, be sure to check with a qualified healthcare professional. Once again, thank you for listening, and we will be back soon with another episode of the Stronger by Science podcast.